We're unmuted. Thanks. Okay. Wow. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Welcome back if you've been here already. And hear me say this. Thank you for joining us for today's event, current event, Archiving the Internet Commons, How Activists Are Fighting the Privatization of the Internet. Happy to welcome in Elena Rowan for this. To help situate you, we're streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space. And here at Fourth Space, we are located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to mobilize knowledge by creating daily activities and events that look at research questions across the university. Running this as a meeting, anyone in the Zoom, feel free to ask questions via the chat or raise your hand. Those of you in the space, we'll get one of our microphones to you during a Q&A period if you have questions. With that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to the Milieu's Head of Communications, Ariana Zefriades. Ariana.
Hi, thank you, Doug. Okay, so I'm really happy to introduce Elena Rowan, a graduate student at Concordia University and member of Milieu. She will be discussing her talk, Archiving the Internet Commons, How Activists Are Fighting the Privatization of the Internet. And Elena's research focuses on digital libraries and archives, the materials held within them, and the people who create and curate them. She explores how activists, archivists, and librarians are expanding access to knowledge inside and outside their institutions, creating new ways for digital materials to exist online, and confronting and navigating existing copyright and property right structures originally built for physical material governance. Elena examines how these activists and librarians are overcoming the dilemma of ownership over the element of ownership and the copywriting of digital materials, caring for and tending to digital materials, and documenting the internet for the years to come. So without further ado, I pass the microphone to Elena.
Can everyone hear me all right? Yes, great. Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to my presentation on the Archiving the Internet Commons, How Activists Are Fighting the Privatization of the Internet. I'm excited to present this research I've been working on over the past year at the Data Justice Hub, which is a part of Milieu. I'll explain that part later. But before I start speaking about the internet as a commons and how archivists are shaping this space, I wanted to briefly discuss what an archive is for the purpose of the presentation. Great. For the purposes of this presentation and my research, an archive is a place for the long-term storage of a collection of materials, including records, documents, and other physical and digital materials of the internet. They're not static. They're living things that grow and change as we interact with them, as they're built up with new information, as they're added to and accessed by others, and as their materials are altered purposefully or unintentionally. Archives are constantly moving and changing. They're also not neutral. Through them, the past can be controlled. Certain stories are privileged and others are marginalized. And archivists, as the people working in and around archives, are an integral part of this storytelling. People often also take archives for granted, but someone must do the work to care for this data. This work involves collecting, tending to, and making the materials accessible. That's where archivists come in. Archivists are people who work to curate and preserve materials and information for future use. But some information is harder to preserve than others. Archiving digital information in particular, especially information created on and for sharing by the public on the internet, has its own unique challenges. So one of these challenges is how to archive materials on an increasingly privatized internet. Though there are still free spaces on the internet as a commons is under threat. The dream held by many that the internet could be a revolutionary common space is under threat from private actors who wish to control major sections from people in various places and spaces. In particular, powerful actors like corporations and governments are looking to privatize the internet and are making efforts to remove and block information which was previously publicly available. These powerful actors are trying to ensure that the internet cannot be used as a common space for all to gather and share. They do this in two ways. First, by privatizing the actual information and content held on the internet, and then by erasing it. So as the internet becomes increasingly privatized, The rights of individual users and communities to their data and creations is disappearing. The internet is increasingly a privatized space controlled by specific companies and platforms. Content we create and post on many of the most popular platforms is not totally in our control. Although created by individuals like us, it's owned by the corporations and organizations who host it. As individuals, we lack a right to own our own data, both that we expressly upload to the internet and the data that's collected on us by bots and cookies and our web browsing history. Although we may share things ourselves online with our own communities, like important family photos or announcements on sites like Facebook or Instagram, or collections of poems on the now defunct poetry.com, that information is not totally in our control, as much as it may seem to be. Not only can it be shared and saved elsewhere, but it can also be erased. So many of us will have heard the quote, "The internet never forgets." This is definitely true, especially for those people whose tweets or photos they uploaded earlier in their lives have now come back to haunt them in the present. But it misses another key point about the internet. The internet erases with ruthless efficiency. Thousands of web pages posted by previous politicians and political regimes outlining their political stances and policies towards controversial topics have been erased. Advertisements for illegal activity conducted by banks and financial organizations is all gone. Memos and reports from oil and gas executives documenting their statements about environmental damages conducted by their businesses, that's all gone. These web pages and information that could be used by journalists, researchers, and activists to hold these powerful actors accountable for their actions, all of this is gone. And individual content creators' information, if hosted on the wrong site, can also be erased at a moment's notice. This happened to millions of individuals with Friendster accounts, Tumblr accounts, and many more. While corporations and governments seem to delete information to cover their tracks, for many tech giants whose platforms dominate online, erasure of our digital history is just collateral damage in their pursuit for growth. So what happens when all of the data and information on the internet is erased? Most of the time, there's only one or a few groups that intervene to prevent this information from being lost. And one of those groups is Archive Team, who I'm going to talk about now. So since 2009, Archive Team has worked to save the internet and all the data and information it holds from being erased. Archive Team archivists use web crawlers and bots to scrape web pages and URL links on the internet, preserving as much data as possible for future recall of websites in their entirety wherever possible. This archival method sets out to provide a snapshot of the internet at any given point in time. Once Archive Team catches wind of shutdowns, shutoffs, mergers, and plain old deletions of websites, they do their best to save history before it's lost forever. Their slogan, "We're coming to rescue your shit," is a clear indication of how they see themselves and their role on the internet. Once they find a disappearing site, they enter the site and try to grab what they can, hoping to salvage the photos, writings, and other memories people have stored there. They've been compared to both firemen and terrorists, depending on how you view their actions. So though I've done interviews with many archivists at this point, for this presentation today, I wanted to put a specific focus on one individual in particular, because they have a crucial role in preserving digital artifacts that might otherwise be lost or destroyed. Because the internet cannot be used as a commons if the public information it's based on is not preserved. Most of the archivists I interviewed requested that their identities remain anonymous. I don't actually know most of their identities, except for the one pictured here, Jason Scott. Jason is the founder of the Archive Team. He himself is a prominent internet archivist with a big internet presence and a background in acting and film. This presentation will focus primarily on him and other members of Archive Team's antics online. So who and what exactly makes up Archive Team? The quote here is from Jason, describing the attributes of an ideal member as kleptomania, paranoia, and rage, because there's a constant worry that everything is not permanent, everything's on shifting sands. Archive Team describes themselves as a loose collective of rogue archivists, programmers, writers, and loudmouths dedicated to saving our digital heritage. Their goal, as I mentioned earlier, is to save history before it's lost forever. And they do this by using various methods to collect, organize, and disseminate information, such as web scraping, data mining, collaborative editing, and using digital crawlers to archive web pages, forums, tweets, YouTube videos, and other digital materials. They consider themselves a kind of emergency response team that comes into action whenever a social media site or other website shuts down. They've been collecting massive amounts of cultural and digital history created over the past 50 years. But Archive Team is still fighting for the dream of the internet as a commons, where individuals, not private corporations or the state, are in control. They are trying to fight back to change the current power dynamic and rescue our collective history on the internet in a small but impactful way. So the activists who make up Archive Team care deeply about what is archived, where it is held, and what it means for the future of the world, both online and off. Their motivations for doing this work are unique and personal, but that they all center around finding value in being part of preserving and documenting pieces of the internet that otherwise would disappear unnoticed. When asked, they talk about working under pressure and deadlines as websites are shutting down, trying to get the work copied in time and feeling like you're doing something important, feeling like they are doing something important with their time. They're a real part of history, and that because they're the only group working on getting a copy of that site, the only people recording this information, it gives them a sense that they're contributing to something greater in the world. And though they don't know who will end up using the site or the tweet they archived, they know it might contribute to something important in the future. So that sense of care for keeping disappearing information free and available to everyone drives them to continue their work despite some of the issues they face. So Archive Team has faced a lot of criticism for their work archiving materials that other people would rather not have preserved on the internet. Controversially, they largely disregard individual ownership and corporate property rights in favor of moving materials into open, freely accessible internet archives. This causes a lot of problems, namely in their selection criteria and their view of ownership and accountability. Their disregard for data ownership has got them in trouble with both content creators like you and me and large corporations wishing that their data was not archived. The biggest thing that they're criticized for, and arguably their strongest stance as an organization helping to support the dream of the internet as a commons, is their insistence on ignoring robot exclusion protocol files or robots.txt files. Robots.txt is a machine-readable text file that sits on web servers that gives instructions as to what items, directories, or sections of a website should not be crawled, that is, viewed by search engines or downloaded via programs or otherwise accessed by automatic means. The reason for adding a robots.txt file to a site is not often given, and in fact, people implement robots.txt for all sorts of reasons. They might not want outdated information in caches, or they might be trying to prevent undue taxing of resources, or they might want to avoid any unpleasant situations where they delete information that is embarrassing or unfavorable, and it ends up still showing up somewhere else. In 2009, as Archive Team was being formed, Jason wrote a manifesto-style paper outlining his approach and opinion on these documents, attached to most major websites. He writes that while robots.txt were an understandable stopgap fix for a temporary problem on the earlier internet, it is a problem that has long since been solved. He believes that rather than providing helpful guidance, robots.txt causes many more problems than it solves, including a loss of historically important and relevant data. He and for the rest of Archive Team, including the Archive Team Warrior, they ignore robots.txt files entirely and believe that everyone else should do so. Their explicit opinion is that if you don't want people to have your data, don't put it online. Unsurprisingly, most of the trouble, both legal and political and ethical, that Archive Team gets into is often centered around their behavior towards this particular piece of internet protocol. Another major challenge that these archivists face is a challenge within their group in deciding what to document and what not to document. They navigate this challenge through a collaborative, holistic decision-making process, loosely follows a hierarchy based on experience or length of time in Archive Team. This decision-making process does sometimes cause issues, especially when they have to decide what materials to archive and what not to. There's an overarching sense of care for the work that they do and the materials that they do archive, and they do archive the majority of materials, as well as a sense of fairness and adherence to ethics, which drives these activists' actions. They know that some of the information being preserved is related to urgent and pressing social justice issues and political upheaval. So this means that archive team must decide what to document and what not to document very quickly without much time for deliberation. In their work, they recognize that the work of archiving is not just about preserving history, but also about creating a living, growing record of the past and the present. They know that the materials they archive have the potential to shape the future, and they do not take this lightly. For example, Jason talked about the difficulties that arose in the past when the team had to decide whether to archive conversations on the controversial web forum then called 8chan. The quote on the screen is from Jason, and it outlines a time when archive team went through a bit of a split. So he says, and I'll read the quote, "There was a schism because what happened is that group was archiving image boards, specifically 4chan, 8chan, and a couple others. And I, in a rare show of power, was like, no, go to hell. We're not going to do that. Because it is designed. It's a machine designed to create offensive material and iterates itself to become more and more offensive. And its power rests in its ephemerality. So by grabbing it through the archive team channels, we are rewarding the offensiveness while punishing the ephemerality. So while archive team's priority is to create a record of the entire internet, including some of its more controversial and problematic corners, they recognize that some materials are not static and don't contribute to what they want to preserve on the internet. So another challenge that they face is attempting to document and record the materials on the internet which people don't want to record. Though they feel very firmly that all information should be archived, archive team have faced significant pushback from corporations and individuals alike who don't want to deal with the data they've created or collected, or as Jason would call it, their digital trash. But very often, they archive the site anyways to the dismay of the corporate owner. In their own words here, they say, but you know, sometimes the company doesn't like it if we archive them, and then we archive them anyway. So there's people that don't like what we do, especially some of the websites that we archive, but you know, that kind of sucks for them. So in the face of this pushback, the archivists continue because their care for the materials themselves and concern over what it would mean as a society to not keep track of our digital past is so great. Caring for the digital materials on the internet and for keeping the internet an open space for use by everyone is a key part of their relationship to these materials and their work as archive team. So by looking at how archive team works, we can ensure that the internet as a commons continues to provide information and knowledge to everyone. Because what will we lose if the internet was erased? In the meantime, Jason and the rest of archive team will continue saving our digital history. They'll continue to build their version of a free and open internet, ignoring corporations' desires to remove public information from the internet and make sure that information is preserved for all of us to use in the future. So I wanted to end by saying a little bit about the Data Justice Hub, but also that if you want to get involved with archive team, it's pretty simple. Just visit their wiki at wiki.archiveteam.org. They always need more people with extra bandwidth to run the archive team warrior and help preserve the internet. Before I open for any questions, I just want to end with a bit about the Data Justice Hub. We're a small research team headed by Dr. Chris Hurl, who's a sociology professor here at Concordia. We're a small part of both Milieu and the Social Justice Center. The team has been conducting research for the past few years on data activists. We've interviewed dozens of data activists and data activist groups on how they gather and make sense of data. We have a podcast and our webinars and have webinars and hosted a workshop all focused on mobilizing data for justice. If you want to hear more about Jason and archive team, I highly recommend listening to our podcast episode with Jason. It's available on our website, YouTube, and all the other regular podcast platforms. So that's it for me for the presentation portion. Does anyone have any questions about anything? Thanks.
Sorry about that. Thank you guys very much for coming into the space. We have a little bit of a break before our next event, which is happening imminently. We're about to end the live stream to YouTube though. So for those of you watching there, that will end shortly. The Zoom will remain open though. Thank you very much.